en el presidio.
Ya va el YouTube. Ahorita les va a aparecer un letrero y ya comenzará. Está un poco lento ahorita.
Iba a decir bien rápido que si escuchan una pianista, no soy yo, obviamente no estoy tocando el teclado y hablando al mismo tiempo, pero estoy en mi oficina y estoy en una escuela de música, entonces pues hay varios instrumentos y están practicando.
Muy bien.
Nos van a
Completamente bien. Bueno, so we are live now. Thank you all for being here in our next session of the HISCATMEX Seminario or workshop. I am Dr. Ricardo Alvarez. I'm very excited to be here with Doctora Teresita Lozano, Ethan Besser-Frederick, and Doctora Marisol Lopez Menendez for what is our next installment titled Memorias Transnacionales de la Guerra Cristera, Transnational Memory of the Cristero Rebellion, the Cristero War. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two presenters first. I will then give them each about 15 to 20 minutes to do their presentation. Then I'll introduce our comentarista, Marisol, and then she will have the floor. Right, so we'll start with Ethan's biography. Ethan Besser-Frederick is a doctoral candidate of history at the University of Minnesota and a host for the New Books Network podcast. His dissertation research explores the transnational network of Catholic activists in Mexico and Spain in the early 20th century. Broadly, he is interested in exploring the connection between violence, memory, and fascist politics in a transnational context. And Teresita Lozano, Doctora Teresita Lozano, is an assistant professor of musicology and ethnomusicology at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. A native of the US-Mexico border, Doctora Lozano engages in research that explores the relationship between music, migration, religion, and identity. A passionate advocate for musical and community activism, she has served as part of collaborative arts projects in public education and immigrant rights movements. Prior to her current position at UTRGV, Doctora Lozano served as a postdoctoral fellow in ethnomusicology at West Virginia University and was previously awarded the prestigious Charlotte Newcomb Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship. She is also an alumna of the Latino Museum Studies Program Fellowship at the Smithsonian Institution. Doctora Lozano holds a BME from Baylor University. Yes, this is where I teach. Awesome. And a PhD, go Sick and Bears, and a PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Colorado Boulder. Fantastic. So I will go ahead and Ethan, who is presenting first, go ahead, take it away. And then Teresita, you can start right after he's done.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. I realized after I submitted the piece that I never contextualized it for you all, so thank you for reading it. It is the final section of a chapter towards the end of my dissertation that I'm drafting now. And so if it feels like I'm referencing other material throughout this piece, I am. And I just didn't want to subject you to reading a whole dissertation. So if you have questions about that, just let me know. I'm just going to read from the piece that I submitted, and I'm very excited for questions and comments you all have. I'm particularly interested in building up my repertoire of the literature on memory of the Cristiada, especially memory this early in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s of it. So I welcome suggestions for further research and reading from you all. So, contested memories of the Cristiada in David. Los Arreglos and Martyrdom. In May 2000, John Paul II officially canonized Miguel Pro and over 20 other martyrs who died in the Cristero War. This act made official the reverence that many Mexicans had felt for decades. Multiple generations of Mexican clergy and activists supported the Cristero martyrs' canonization bids. These figures could now be marked as official heroes of counter-revolution. Domestically, the canonization was mirrored by the historic victory of the National Action Party in the July presidential election, unseating the PRI. Practically and symbolically, opponents of the 1917 Constitution had much to celebrate. This was a story of success for conservative Catholicism. However, I argue this canonization should also be understood as a victory of one specific faction of the Mexican right. Of the 25 men canonized in 2000 and the 12 later beatified in 2005, most were priests. This was due to the political nature of martyrdom narratives that emerged during and after the First Cristero War. Hagiographies of those who died in the war differed in tone and content depending on the political views of the account's authors. Members of La Liga and their affiliate organizations supported a hardline military approach to the religious question, the questions of the role of the Catholic faith in public life. This is especially true after violence escalated and broke out in 1926. La Liga's accounts of those who died in the war emphasized heroic and forceful resistance to a state they found tyrannical. Mexican bishops and those allied with them viewed the rebellion ultimately as a strategic mistake that put the Mexican church in conflict with official Vatican policy. They marked clergy almost exclusively as martyrs for their faith and emphasized peaceful, nonviolent resistance. This position was ultimately affirmed in the 20th century canonizations, both because clergy were overwhelmingly recognized, and secondly, accounts of their deaths emphasized their peaceful, nonviolent resistance to the state. I argue, while this disagreement never escalated into a full breach during the Cristero War, I argue it shaped the project's ability to establish official memory of the conflict in the 1930s and afterwards. In this section of my dissertation chapter on memory, I will examine the Cold War Catholic periodical David. David initially published clandestinely from 1936 to 1939, and it reinitiated publication from 1952 to 68, the period I'll be mostly evaluating here. Billed as being by and for old comrades and the children of Cristeros, a portion of every edition, in fact, a large portion of every edition, was dedicated to reader-submitted accounts of martyrs and los muertos from the Cristiada. These accounts offer a starkly different understanding of martyrdom from what was offered by the Church in 2000, which includes those who violently opposed the government. The editors of David used submitted martyrdom accounts to paint a picture of an idealized Christian society. In this imagined world, Mexicans showed deference and unwavering loyalty to the wealthy, educated men who invariably made up the ranks of David's martyrs. David and the post-Cristiada right. David emerged after a long period of reorganization in the Mexican right. After the Arreglos of 1929, right-wing lay activists constructed a new social and political organizations that either did not include the clergy or reserved leadership positions for laymen, which differs from the organizations that existed before the war. Revolutionary Mexican Action, better known as the Gold Shirts publicly, the Sinarquistas, and the National Action Party are some of the most prominent of these groups, many of which still exist today. While they differed in their strategic approach to the pre-regime, these organizations were united around two key ideas: anti-communism and fear that Mexican culture, especially the integrity of the family, was under attack by foreign cultural forces. David is launched in response to this. It also reflects the political leanings of its founder and editor, Aurelio Robles Acevedo. Acevedo was born in Zacatecas in 1900 and participated in the first Cristiada, eventually rising to the rank of general. He was even the provisional governor of Zacatecas, named by La Liga during the conflict. After the peace agreement, he was involved in a number of different Catholic periodicals as a form of living until he died in 1968. And he's so tied to David that David ceases publication when he dies. So they're very connected together. Acevedo never accepted the legitimacy of the 1917 Constitution or pre-regime, but he moderated his position in the 1950s relaunch of David. And I would argue this is because of the context of the Cold War. David did not call for an armed opposition to the pre-state. Instead, the magazine sought to establish a counter-hegemonic history of the Cristiada, especially the war's meaning and daily life in the 1920s. Importantly, David made this project participatory by inviting reader submissions of photographs and accounts from the conflict. Submissions came both from those who lived during the period and from family and friends of deceased Cristeros. I argue this memory project was in opposition to both prehistory of the revolution and its aftermath and the church's position on martyrdom during the conflict. To accomplish these ends, David's accounts of the war created a nostalgic past in which social relations in Mexico were harmonic and abided by Catholic teachings. I split the paper up then into 3 sections based on the kinds of memories submitted, and I won't go into all of them in length because I don't want to take up too much time. The first section, and the most important one for this project, is Heroes and Martyrs. David marked some submitted stories as worthier of celebration than others. Acevedo labeled particularly detailed and praiseworthy accounts as Nuestros Héroes and Nuestros Mártires. Notably, these heroes and martyrs are all men, invariably. And though labeled differently, accounts with the title of hero often refer to their subject as a martyr within the text. And so I started to see hero and martyr as very interchangeable terms within the text of David. These labels were provocative for at least two reasons. First, officially, all of these men were rebels and often executed as criminals. Second, the church officially holds the sole right of designating martyrs of the Catholic faith, and Mexico's bishops did not award recognition to many. Even during the war, the bishops followed the Vatican's lead of only referring generally to the martyrs of Mexico, without elevating or mentioning many particular cases. By labeling particular figures as martyrs, Acevedo superseded church authority. His admiration implied these men could be venerated and their bodily remains may be holy relics, even if they were never officially beatified. In effect, the labels in David legitimized unofficial Catholic worship. The men that David marked for martyrdom shared many traits. Just as the church was prone to elevating the stories of clergy, David reported the stories of lay activists and militants. David labeled martyrs were disproportionately educated middle-class men from families who owned factories or haciendas. For example, Manuel Moreno Aldrete, killed in battle in 1928, was born to an hacendado family in Jalisco. Accounts of these men fit the model of a charitable Christian property owner. After finishing his studies, Moreno returned to his family's estate, where he was a caring and considerate father of the peons. That's the term that the article uses. The account of an urban member of the middle class, a Señor Ingeniero Don Miguel Rodriguez Rubalcaba, emphasized his participation in the Workers' Association and charitable works in the Knights of Columbus. None of the submitted accounts in David mention abusive bosses or landowners, even when describing political opponents. And this surprised me. I'd expected them to say something nasty about pre-supporters. Together, these descriptions present a very sanitized version of Mexico's economic relations, both in the Porfiriato and then during the Cristiada itself. As the magazine by and for old Cristeros and their children, this provided a historical narrative that affirmed Cristeros' innocence and a great injustice done by land reform and other economic projects of the PRI. I go on to outline a couple particular cases of martyrs and heroes, but I'm going to move on to some of the other sections just so I don't eat into too much time. The next section is Our Dead. In contrast to the category of martyr, the heading Nuestros Muertos was used expansively to include a large number of humble stories. The account of Señor Gregorio Murillo is exemplary of many stories that fall in this category. Murillo was the assistant to General Jesus Degollado Guizar. Degollado authored Murillo's story for David, so he's the person that submits it. Murillo is introduced as a poor but intelligent indigenous man of good character. Like many other accounts that fall under Our Dead, most of Murillo's story is a bulleted list of the battles that he played a part in. The reader knows, for instance, that he attacked and took Juchitlan on September 19th, 1927, without ever really learning what capacity he served in during the fight or any particularly heroic deeds. Murillo's death is also vaguely described, which contrasts him very much with martyrs, whose deaths, final night, last words are described in great detail. Degollado merely states that Murillo was killed on suspicion of being a bandit after the war ended. Instead of mentioning any of these details, Degollado's account of Murillo makes extensive notes on his loyal service to the general. Quote, he knew of the great reward that was offered for the death of his general, and he had 2,000 opportunities to kill him if he had been a bad man. Many times he handled the general's money and never dispensed of a centavo without permission. Murillo is praiseworthy, therefore, because he was a good servant who behaved within the bounds of his expected social situation. His qualities as a soldier or pious Catholic are never mentioned, compared to the heroic military deeds of those that fall under the heroes and martyrs sections. Instead, it is clear that Degollado remembers Murillo as a uniquely virtuous servant. The final section in the paper is on the exemplary lives of women, and it's on the handful of stories of women that appear. Women rarely appear in David as subjects in Cristero history. When they do, their stories are meant to illustrate an ideal Catholic woman and what she should be like. Accounts of women are denied an analytical count of martyr or even dead, and so they're never grouped together under something called Cristero women or some category like that. Instead, each one is given their own headline as though each one is an anomaly. Maria Carmen Robles' account, for instance, is titled Vidas Ejemplares, exemplary life, although her story is the only one to bear this designation. Carmelita, as the article calls her in the diminutive, was born in 1880 to a poor family and was never educated. The article claims that this never negatively impacted her, however, because of her, quote, natural liveliness and clear intelligence, end quote, made for its own Christian education. Despite her hard upbringing and the trials of her life, she was always kind and affable to her persecutors, as the article mentions. She was, in short, a model daughter. Before mentioning any biographical information about her, Acevedo's article first lists her virtues as a woman, alphabetizing them in a list: humility, piety, mortification, deference to priests, and purity. Acevedo annotated each of these virtues with concrete examples. Carmelita's humility was exemplified by the fact that she spent most of her life as a domestic worker, sewing and repairing clothes for her employers. But she never attempted to wear fine clothing that she made for her wealthy employers. Again, she knows her place. Only after this meditation on female virtue does the reader learn that Carmelita was a vital source of intelligence for the Cristero commanders during the war. Unlike many other victims in accounts of executions, Carmelita has no final words or prayer at her death. She is never described as a martyr, a hero, a Cristero, or even described as our dead. Instead, she's an external anomalous force, an idealized model of Christian femininity. I bring this to conclusion. A majority of each edition of David was dedicated to stories of the past. Submissions telling the stories of martyrs and the dead were nestled between editorials explaining why we fought and accounts of particular battles. David included current affairs sections, which usually describe the Red Terror threatening places around the world, or a recent statement from the Pope. But the magazine, I think, is best understood as a memory project. It sought to establish a counter-hegemonic understanding of the years immediately following the Mexican Revolution, and to stake a claim to Mexican notions of martyrdom. To these ends, Acevedo and the authors who submitted stories presented an idealized past where Cristeros were part of a harmonic society in which women submitted to men, workers were loyal and honest, and property owners were charitable and kind fathers. This nostalgia likely met the taste of both segments of the target audience of David. Old Cristeros could imagine their war as a grand lost cause for a world adrift in Mexico's economic miracle. For the children of the Cristeros, these accounts presented an aspirational archetype and an alternative understanding of their national and religious identities. While these sorts of narratives would ultimately be shut out of the canonization victory held by the church in 2000, they played a significant role in shaping collective memory around the Cristiada and conservative Catholicism in Mexico in the 20th century. Thank you.
Great work, Ethan. That was very fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think many of us will be excited to see how this work develops over time. So now I turn it over to Teresita, who I introduced earlier. So thank you both for being here. Teresita, when you're ready, go ahead and take it away. We can see your screen, but you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I think I was sharing the wrong screen, which is why I was like, okay, trying to
That's
select
okay.
the right one. Okay. There we go.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So the title of my paper that I submitted, which was actually one of the chapters of my dissertation, and I am so thankful to those of you who read it in its entirety, but I felt like I couldn't extrapolate all of the context to this really fascinating group called Mariachi Los Cristeros. And the presentation itself is called Reimagining Parody and Inherited Memory of the Post-Revolutionary Cristero Rebellion. So these are Mariachi Los Cristeros. This is the only photo I've been able to actually secure of them, and I got it with permission from the group. So this is kind of their, I guess their titular title that they use for promotional gigs or performances. And of course, this is them in full gear. So we have the archetypal characters of Pillo el Monaguillo, and we have El Padre, el General Campesino, and El Campesino Menor. And sometimes they actually interchange, so they change costumes, but most of the time I think Pillo remains in character. He doesn't change into other characters. So Mariachi Los Cristeros is led by a man named Ildefonso Moya, who directs this larger mariachi group called Mariachi Moya de Acatic. And the group itself calls itself a mariachi tradicional. So they are a mariachi group from around, with the instrumentation from the time of the Cristero Rebellion and the Mexican Revolution, and then into the Cristero Rebellion. So they only have a few instruments, no trumpets, very much an acoustic group. And they are an alter ego of Mariachi Moya. So they're 4 members of the larger mariachi group that will do a pre-concert to the Mariachi Moya concerts. And they don't consider themselves a sacred ensemble or a religious mariachi, which is important to emphasize because there are mariachis that play in churches and that play for masses. And this mariachi definitely does not do that. They play in religious festivals, and most of the time they are actually making fun of the church. So you wouldn't want them in mass, you know, acting the way that they do. So they have quite a bit of a presence on social media and recordings, but you can't actually get their physical recordings unless you talk to them. So they primarily prioritize regional performances of Jalisco's cultural patrimony. They play traditional Mexican mariachi repertoire, but they also perform new Cristero corridos, and I will talk about what I mean by that in just a second. They've also had collaborations with the Secretaría de Cultura de Jalisco, and so they are really promoters of regional history and culture and intangible heritage of the region. So an introduction to some of the characters. We have 4 musicians, 2 on violin each, a guitarrón and a vihuela. And first we have Pillo el Monaguillo, who is mostly the spokesperson for the group. He is the one who speaks the most and explains all the cultural and historical significance of the songs when they perform. He engages the most with the audience, but he has very sexual and patronizing humor, especially toward El Padre. And next we have El Padre, who's supposed to be this Cristero priest who reprimands his fellow Cristeros for their vulgarity and but also participates in mockery of Catholic clergy with this superficial piety, acting, you know, as if he's very religious, but he also loves dancing. And so there's a lot of interaction between Pillo el Monaguillo and El Padre, or the Cristero priest. Then we have El General Campesino, who is supposed to represent a rural militant, like a typical Cristero, you know, from the highlands of Jalisco. He has a more reserved personality. He's supposed to represent the Cristero laity, and he has an allegiance to El Padre, like anything El Padre says, like he follows, sort of playing on this idea of blind allegiance to the church. And he's dedicated to modeling good behavior, especially for his son, who's El Campesino Menor. So El Campesino Menor doesn't talk very much either, but he does laugh at all of the antics that Pillo el Monaguillo and El Padre undertake. And then every time he laughs, his father, El General Campesino, will like slap him and tell him to stop laughing. So it's very much this physical humor as well as musical humor. So the way that Mariachi Los Cristeros really interact with their audience is that they educate them on the history of Jalisco and through dramatic reenactment, but with no props. It's just them retelling these stories. And they talk and act as if they were still during the 1920s, even though they are also make reference to things that are very much in the present. So this is all called anachronisms. They also participate in satirical acts, meaning that they pretend to bless each other, they pretend to give each other communion, very much in a medieval Chaucer-like parody of religious practices. But they don't have any spiritual practice or efficacy. So they never do this in an actual mass setting, obviously, but they do play and perform a lot at religious festivals, at kermeses, bazaars, and any sort of regional feast days in Acatic. So what's so fascinating about their performances is that they interweave local history and intentional parody of the Moya family's inherited culture. So what the Moya family remembers of La Cristiada. But what's fascinating is that none of the members of the Moya family that are alive today were alive during the Cristero Rebellion at all. So this is all inherited memory and comes from family lore and family stories, as well as regional Catholic culture. So they don't prioritize or abide by authenticity-centered definitions of living history. So if they, get their dates mixed up, somebody might call them out on it and they'll say like, well, this is just how I remember it. And they get, very defensive about it because they're supposed to be in character. And what's really interesting is that these characters, Pillo, the priest, and the two campesinos, they don't actually represent specific people. They're these general archetypes, caricatures of cristeros from the time period. And they're supposed to be interpreted as icons and cultural symbols with costumes. So the characters introduce themselves as religious participants in the Cristero Rebellion. When they go out on stage, they claim that they're being persecuted by calles and that, it's important for all the Cristeros to stick together. And then they start playing music and playing some of these corridos from the time period as well as new corridos. And on the stage, they don't have any props, just their costumes and their instruments. So the way that they invoke a historical space is through dialogue, through talking to the audience about, places that no longer exist, talking about historical figures as if they were still alive, and recounting their experiences on the battleground, especially the campesinos. And then they invite the audience to accept their stage as a historical space. So they very much value interactive environment, meaning that they ask the audience questions or have the audience ask them questions. Sometimes they'll go out into the audience and dance with them or make comments about audience members and act as if they were, in the times of the revolution and making fun of the way that they dress. So it almost feels like you're at some sort of Renaissance fair when you're participating in their performances. So they're meant to relay these experiences of La Cristiada through dialogue that will resonate with multi-generational post-Cristiada audience, meaning that an audience that has no living memory of La Cristiada and only knows about it either through family legacy, through history books, through regional history, or through music. So there's this interplay between them that acts as, public recollection. And I refer to this as rememory because they're taking memories that they inherited and they're reinterpreting it for an audience. And sometimes those memories can change and morph depending on the performance itself, what lends itself to being funny, or but they do try to prioritize some historical facts as well. So what exactly are new Cristero corridos? A little bit of context that I kind of alluded to in my chapter was that historical corridos were corridos or ballads that were written during La Cristiada and shortly after. And a few of them were adopted into the commercial sphere, like El Corrido de Valentín de la Sierra and El Corrido Quirino Navarro. So those you would have heard like on the radio or on recordings, and they're very much a musical oral history of the rebellion. So I differentiate between that and new Cristero corridos, which are written long after the end of the rebellion and are composed by individuals who have no living memory of the Cristero rebellion. So these compositions act as inherited cultural memory and rememory of the time period. They reimagine life and culture from that time. And the three that I mentioned in the chapter, of course, are El Corrido de Miguel Gómez Loza, El Corrido de Pío Quinto Moya, and El Corrido de un Cristero. So the corridos associated with Pío Quinto Moya and Miguel Gómez Loza, these are actual historical figures. So Pío Quinto Moya is the patriarch of the Moya family, who are the main participants or performers in Mariachi Los Cristeros. And they claim that their grandfather wrote the corrido Quirino Navarro, and there's no historical context for that at all. I've looked, but people don't actually know who wrote it, so he could have written it. And that's what makes this so interesting about including some of this regional history from Acatic into their performances. And then, of course, they have the Corrido de Miguel Gómez Loza, which many of you are already familiar with who Miguel Gómez Loza is and his role in La Unión Popular. They refer to him as El Rey de los Cristeros, which I thought was really interesting. And neither of these corridos are found in historical repertoire that has been collected from the time period, meaning that there are about 70 corridos from the times of La Cristiada that were composed and shared and performed, and these two are not found in that list, meaning that they're very much newly composed, but about historical figures. And I've always thought it fascinating that they claim their grandfather or great-grandfather, who was a cristero, wrote the corrido about Quirino Navarro, when Quirino Navarro was an enemy of the cristeros, technically. So, and did not get along with the cristeros. I always thought that was really interesting. And then, of course, the corrido called El Corrido de un Cristero, which has no name. It's this broad memory of a young cristero, and it resurrects his epic hero's bravery, faith, and courage. So I wanted to play some of the corridos because as a musician, you can't have a presentation without the actual music. So I wanted to play just a snippet of their performance for a local TV station. And this was from around 2010. I estimate that their compositions are from the early 2000s, approximately 2009, so not too long ago, but certainly long after the Cristero Rebellion. So here is the Corrido de Miguel Gómez Loza. I'm just going to play a little bit of it, and then I'm going to play another excerpt of a corrido. Can you hear okay? Okay.
En el pueblo Paredones, municipio de Acatí, ahora se llama El Refugio. Yo se los quiero decir, nació un hombre muy valiente, como los que hay por allí. 11 de agosto, por cierto, la fecha no tiene errores, nació Miguel Gómez Loza, en esa tierra de amores, año de 1888, señores. Viva Cristo Rey, decía, viva México también, la Virgen de Guadalupe, que desde el cielo nos ve, ha de darnos valentía para defender su fe. Fue jefe de los cristeros, los de la Unión Popular, de Cerro Gordo a Picayos, Arandas de Patitlán.
Okay, so if I would love to keep going because I love these corridos, but let's listen to another one. So this one, I actually have to fast forward. They really only put their entire repertoire on YouTube as if there was just one record. And so you have to go through the entire video to find some of these performances. All right. Let me find. Okay, so this is El Corrido de un Cristero.
Ahí le va mi Colima, gente cristera. Señores, tengan presente algo que aquí sucedió. En el año 26 inició la rebelión del gobierno de Plutarco, una orden se giró. cierren toditos los cultos, la ley ahora ya cambió. Coquimatlán, pueblo santo, respetuoso del Creador. Preguntaba Matellito, Señor, tú da tu opinión. Luego que giró su orden, el campesino alistó, sacando las carabinas, a Cristo Rey defendió.
All right, so just 1 second. That's pretty much what I have some time for. I had some other things, but I wanted to make sure that we have more time to actually talk for comments. But what I found really interesting about that particular corrido is that it's not celebratory. It actually is more sad, because when the Cristero dies, it says on his gravestone, you know, according to the corrido, that he never found out who won in La Cristiada, whether it was the Cristeros or the government, and also questions, you know, whether this war was even worth fighting for. So I found that really interesting. But thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't run out of time, but I always want to play the music because that's important. All right, so thank you.
Thank you, Teresita. That was fantastic. Everybody loves the music, so maybe we can have some time later on to hear some more. But no, really excited for your work. Really exciting stuff. So thank you. I am now going to introduce our comentarista, la doctora Marisol López Menéndez. Es doctora en sociología por la New School for Social Research, maestra en estudios políticos y sociales por la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas de la UNAM y licenciada en ciencia política por esa misma institución. Es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 2 y es autora del libro Miguel Pro, Martyrdom and Politics in 20th Century Mexico, entre otras publicaciones, y ha coordinado varios libros colectivos sobre religión en México, memoria y movilización, como Los Mártires y sus 2022. Pertenece a las líneas de investigación Sociología de Cultura y Teoría Social y Política del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales de la Ibero, y participa activamente en diversas redes nacionales e internacionales de estudio de derecho religioso, como esta. Actualmente lleva a cabo el proyecto de investigación Martirio, Secularidad y Movilización Social en México y América Latina de 1950 al 88. Ha vinculado su interés en el desarrollo de la sociedad civil con la sociología de la religión, utilizando herramientas de la sociología política tradicional y la teoría social para estudiar asuntos como el martirio y la dimensión social de los milagros en la Iglesia Católica, y otras formas no católicas de martirio en su relación con la movilización social y la consolidación de instituciones. En fin, muchas gracias, Marisol, por estar acá. Escuchamos atentamente tus comentarios.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Well, that came a little longer than expected. Sorry about that. Well, thank you both for letting me comment on your work and for letting us all read it. It's great work, guys, and I'm really excited about making some comments about it. I hope they are helpful. First and foremost, I'd like to start with some minor, I'm sorry, but just minor corrections on your spelling. I know because you are not native Spaniards, you can probably don't get this, but in Ethan's text, you keep spelling Acevedo with an A, and it's with an E. It is Acevedo. So that's important because it's going to be in your dissertation and eventually for publishing. So that's just what a minor thing I want to underline. And then with Teresita, I think, Teresita, that Acatic doesn't have an accent in the second in the I. That's I'm probably wrong, but I'll double check that. Anyway, let's start with a important matters. Well, let's start with Ethan, which is the first one we heard. He actually did a very, very good job at undertaking martyrdom as a problem in the Cristero enterprise, not only because it is a historical problem, it remains a historical problem, but because it was a problem at the time. And I think his paper very well underlines the fact that martyrdom was a problem for the Liguero people. Maybe, Ethan, I mean, I haven't read the rest of your work, so maybe I'm going to say things that you already tackled elsewhere, but anyway. Maybe what I would add is the actual fight between Liguero people and the church during the 30s. Especially after 1929, when the agreements were signed and everything, and the League was actually expelled from the church, and all the changes made by the Catholic Action and etc. in terms of the new agreements actually reduced all the Liguero fighters to criminals. And that's something Acevedo never forgot. That's I think key to understanding why martyrdom was very different from Ligueros in the 30s and in the 50s from what had been defined earlier on in the Cristero rebellion, during the first Cristero rebellion in 1926. So I think that's something that would be helpful to add to your chapter, because somehow it seems that everything stems from Acevedo, and that I don't think is the case. Maybe further contextualization would be helpful for you. The first thing I'll say is, well, there are a few things that I think would be helpful for you to check on actual archive, but mainly scholarship on the Cristiada has been very, very indulgent with Acevedo and with David. So probably you can I don't know, double check that, or, you know, take it with a little bit of suspicion. Well, I think one of the things that you should probably take into account is that the Vatican politics changed very dramatically after the agreements. Well, but not only because of the agreements, it's not only a Mexican thing, and but not only because of the agreements, it's not only a Mexican thing, and we are talking here about transnational memory, so it's good to say so. The turn Vatican politics took after the Lateran agreements actually changed everything the Vatican had been doing in the past with regard to national states. So, and Mexico wasn't an exception. So martyrs became something very, very different for the church. And, you know, Cristero fighters didn't take that well. So after the agreements, we have two different things that should come into play. On the one hand, the Vatican policy, like a global policy, and on the other, you know, the resentment that Cristero fighters still had, because they had been really mistreated after, well, to say the least, after the agreements. Now, in the 50s and 60s, which is the second part of your analysis, well, the party had become an anti-communist pillar, so church-state relations really improved. at the time, and anti-communism is one of the most important part. In that sense, the right became closer to the status quo, which can explain why David and Aurelio Acevedo also were tamer in the 50s. That's something that I think you should probably add to your paper, the fact that the past, or memory better, memory always speaks to the present. It speaks to the present and not to the past. Even if it is about the past, it speaks to whatever we are living right now. Maybe if you look at military and economic relations between the right and the status quo, we can say, that would help. I can think of two people who are working on that, and their work is really good. One is Luis Serran, with an H, and the other is Austreberto Martinez. He is part of this network, so you can check on his work pretty easily. Well, now you say that David sought to establish a counter-hegemonic history of the Cristiada, and I agree, of course, but the point is Acevedo succeeded, and he succeeded via Jean Meyer. David was the main source of Jean Meyer's research. This has been very, very much criticized, and it's really interesting to see how actually Meyer transformed the Cristero fight into this epic, which is not necessarily the truth. But there is a scholarship on that, and I really, it would really help you if you could just check it out, because when Meyer wrote his Cristiada, which has become like canonical for all of us, he was actually relying on David's accounts and on the people who actually wrote David and who read David, and that's very, very much part of your research. That's something I don't think should be amiss. Well, in that sense, I think you should probably open up your take on the magazine, because it was indeed a vehicle for the recreation of a past, of a Mexican past, but also it did so at a time when the past was speaking very loudly to whatever Mexicans were living. In the 30s, we can just see, well, Lázaro Cárdenas was there, the socialist education program was at the top of everybody's concerns, both the church, Catholics, and the government. So it is not just a random fact. I think that's something you should probably look into. Now, I wouldn't say that Acevedo superseded the church authority by naming martyrs. He was actually relying in a very, very strong tradition coming from the Cristero time and also from the revolution. And I think in that sense, both your work and Teresita's are opening new avenues, new scholarship avenues, because we are actually seeing how revolutionary thinking and Cristero thinking were in a way attuned to the same values. The period, the 96-29 period, actually helped the League establish a new martyrial tradition, and they were naming martyrs all the time. And if you check Desde mi sótano or that kind of leaflets, because those were not magazines, you can actually see how they were creating their own martyrs, with no church authority and no importance about it. In that sense, you should probably check Matthew Butler's book on, I think that's the one on Michoacán. And there, Matthew makes a very good argument about how at the time, during the 1926-1929 Cristero fight, people were left adrift, and they were completely out of touch in many cases with priests. So this implied a very strong point for lay people, because they suddenly became owners of the church. And that's something, it might be helpful. I'm sure it's not nice for me to say this, but in my book on Pro, I also have a discussion about it, and how actually martyrs were a very important part of how lay people reenacted their faith, and how they actually ignored the church. So I think Acevedo is actually relying on that tradition and not creating it by himself, and that's something that you should probably take into account for your paper. Now, there are very, very interesting points in two accounts. One of them is the fact that David made a difference between martyrs and what it's called our death, being the later poor people, obscure people with no relevance, no political relevance. Women as vidas ejemplares, not martyrs, not our death. And the way in which David exalted middle-class men, which is very, very important. He was part of the League, and the League was, in the most part, made of middle-class, white, lawyers and professional people who were very, very different from priests, but also from what you call our death. These persons who actually died but were not considered as martyrs. Now, the part about vidas ejemplares we were talking at the beginning of this session, it's a very, very interesting and very good point. I don't think nobody has taken the time yet to explore the problem of martyrs regarding to women. Most of the work about women is about the brigadas, or what women did for the Cristero fight, but not about their martyrdom. And many women died, but they were not regarded as such. Probably, well, the cases you bring are very, very interesting, and I would just say it was interesting to see how they were labeled. One of them, Maria del Carmen, she's called Carmelita in a very childish manner, which I think is interesting for your argument. I mean, this is not part of the Cristero of the Cristero enterprise only, but also part of what women were considered at the time. I was just reading accounts of revolutionary women, you know, people, women who were with Zapata, and there are interesting texts that actually ask revolutionaries to bring their women to prepare food or to clean weapons and everything, very much in the same way as Cristeros treated women. So I think maybe there is a note to say about this, but nonetheless, it's very interesting that you take women's into the picture. And well, lastly, I think it has a lot of potential. Your chapter is very, very interesting, and you are bringing new, not only new accounts, but new archival research, which is very, very good. So keep up the good work, and I hope these comments help you to better draft it for your dissertation. If you want, we can just chat later about some other things that I can give you, especially about Jean Meyer and all the other people that I mentioned. And well, now let me go to Teresita, which Teresita, I found your piece really fascinating in many accounts. First, what you have done with Mariachi Los Cristeros and Mariachi Moya is very, very interesting in because you are actually, well, that's my take on it only, but you are actually talking about this group who's appealing to both Catholic and more secular Mexicans, and that's something that I really enjoyed. And it seems to me that Mariachi Los Cristeros is also trying to appeal to more secular Mexicans on many accounts. Many of the features you put in your paper are really interesting and do not speak about this Cristero tradition. I think you put it very well, but to a new strain of musical, you know, a new musical genre in Mexico, which is more a satirical thing that any of the corridos, the traditional corridos we have. And that's really interesting. I was wondering if you could, or if you had talked about their relationship with the Secretaría de Cultura, because that might explain why they are so much into talking about history, but in a non-religious way. They are more like, especially Pillo, his all his speeches are about how to understand history, how to remember historical facts, how to keep them in mind when we are talking about something from the past, but we have to do it from a very almost you know, scholarly perspective, and that's something I found interesting. Now, what I was thinking when reading your piece, wow, we are really secular now. I mean, this is the most the greatest piece I have seen talking about secularism in Mexico, because not only Pillo is a very, you know, he's always trying to bother like these canonical figures, El Padre especially, but also most of the traditional teachings of the church and etc. But people enjoy it, and that's something that I really couldn't stop thinking about. How far have we gone since the 1920s. Now, I just thought that unlike Chaucer's characters, which you mentioned in your paper, we Mexicans are laughing at Mariachi Los Cristeros from a different perspective. Because we are laughing at what used to be, not long ago, a family tradition, not at consecrated authorities that remain in power. And that's something that I think changed a little bit the contrast you make between Chaucer's characters and Mariachi Los Cristeros. Now, in that sense, I was thinking that probably ecumenism and the religious market emerging out of Protestant denominations in Mexico, and also the weakened leadership of the Catholic Church are really part of this mockery. And I think they are not speaking about the past, but again about the present. Now, they are for sure paid by a governmental agency, which I was talking about earlier, and they, of course, it is not part of this of any complot or anything, but they do have this mandate to enlighten audiences. So I can understand a little bit how Pillo character became so savvy about history. Now, there are two more points that I really found interesting. One is the point of it is blood that matters, and this comparison you make between menstruation and martyrdom. This is something really, really interesting. I loved it. And I think it makes us go to this tradition, this Mexican tradition, in which we really are appealed by the flow, blood flowing. So I think you can go further into that direction. It's very, very interesting. I know your paper is not about it, but it's a great finding. And now there is this one corrido you mentioned, Valentín de la Sierra. That corrido is very interesting because it was very popular in the 60s. In the 60s, early 70s, even when I was a child in the early 80s, my parents used to listen to that corrido very much. It was something we used to hear at home. And the point was, my father wasn't Catholic. He was a communist. And my mother wasn't a Catholic also. So I think that corrido appeals to values that are broader than Catholic values. This idea of chivalry, bravery, courage are very important, and they are shared both by Cristeros and non-Cristeros alike at the time, in the 20s and later on. So I think, again, as I was saying with Ethan, this opens up a new avenue in scholarship, and because you guys are really narrowing the gap between Catholic scholarship and non-Catholic scholarship, which has been very much in tension since probably Jean Meyer published La Cristiada. So that would be pretty much all I have for now, but I'm really glad to have read your papers. And of course, if I can help with something, just let me know. And I think Ricardo left, so I'm okay. So I'm here on my own. Well, I don't know if people, well, if you guys have something to say, Ethan, Teresita, and if not, well, we can just open the floor for others to react, to comment, etc.
I'll let you go first, Ethan, if you want to respond to something that Marisol had said, or if you prefer to open it up.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. The only thing that I think I would say is lots of the points you've made or works that you reference are things that are in my mind or in other places in the chapter, because like I said, this is the last chapter in the dissertation. But it's good to know, it's always good to know what sort of context I need to carry throughout, even if I've mentioned it earlier. There are definitely a few things I will send you an email, a few sources or that I would love to get from you. But otherwise, thank you so much for your very thorough
thank you so much. And great work. Great work.
Otherwise, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Marisol, for your comments. I would love to talk to you more about, the differences between the way that Chaucer, like my comparisons to Chaucer and the way that you believe that Mexicans are actually viewing this, just because I would be interested in seeing if you have any literature that I could, rely on to make those changes. I think I chose Chaucer more based on my familiarity with what I studied in school and what many people are required, at least in the United States, to study in high school, of parodies of the church and satire, and that even in Europe, so many swear words and vulgarities are always mocking the church and, like mocking the host, like communion or just the altar or everything. And so I found it, something that I felt would have been a strong comparison, but now my interest is piqued. So I don't have any response yet because I have to do some more research, but I really appreciate those comments. And I'm so glad that you were struck by the whole comparison of, blood flowing in battle and this idea of menstruation it caught me off guard when I listened to it, because we're just not so used to not hearing that, and I don't know if it was my very conservative upbringing when I was little that we just don't talk about that in public. But then here these four men dressed as a priest and a altar boy, shouting "Long live menstruation" was so interesting and saying, and they're like, "Oh, no, you meant revolution." He's like, whatever. What means that blood will flow in Mexico, blood will flow. So it was, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm glad that caught your attention, and I would love to go further in it. And I think there's just a lot of different avenues that this research can go, which is why hopefully there'll be multiple articles out of this. So thank you so much, Marisol. And Oh, go ahead.
No, you're very welcome. And I was thinking when I was reading your piece, I was thinking more about jugglers in the continental tradition. Maybe France, Italy, those, and there is this group. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Lelutier, this Argentinian group. Just look them up. It's fantastic, and I think they are more attuned. Well, I mean, it's not that Chaucer is a bad idea. I think it is a very good and productive idea, but this is also a very recent thing. Lelutier, well, they are very old right now, but they started working, I think, in the 70s maybe, and they actually mock everything. But they are dressed up like these symphonic players, and they make their own instruments. Just look them up. They are on YouTube and everywhere. And maybe that'll give you a different idea about what the mariachi was going into. Not that Chaucer is a bad thing, but I think maybe this will open up new things. And I was, just because when I was reading, I was thinking about them and say, well, maybe they have this new pupils here and they don't know it. Anyway, guys, the rest of you, if you want to talk about something, make any kind of comments. I think Christina, were you raising your hand, Christina? Yes, she is.
Well, I was turning around and moving my cat.
Oh, well,
but I do have, yeah,
go ahead.
but I am fascinated by both these pieces of research. I want to fall down an internet rabbit hole and listen to corridos all night. But and with all the really important cautionaries that Marisol you laid out about ways that Jean Mayer and my approach to David, from graduate school onward was shaped by reading it cited in his work and needing to reevaluate that. But all the same, there seems to be a point of connection between the last corrido that you played for us, Teresita, in which the singer, is asking, like, what was this war for? Who won? That sort of thing. And the ways in which, again, in David, I've never gotten to read it systematically, so I kind of envy you that from people who have these strange hobbies reading through Catholic periodicals. It's, I guess, counter-hegemonic in multiple ways. It's challenging the Mexican revolutionary government or the official party's version of history, as well as Marisol mentioned, the 1930s, oh no violence, we don't talk about this message of the time. So, while it could be dangerous to take it literally very often, I think kind of connecting these and taking these former combatants and the lived memory in the present memory of a former combatant seriously in some ways could be very interesting to connect. How do you, and it'd be interesting for both of you to answer either in the corrido form or in the more systematic survey of the material published, usually by male authors, is my impression, sometimes about women. I think very rarely might there have been an acknowledged woman author, but still about mixed feelings and regrets, if you want to put it that way, or if it could be put that way, about participation in the Crisiada. It is amazing. So I'm interested in your perspective, particularly on that, because it makes it all the more astounding that the way in which Cristobal Magallanes and the others, these martyrs, were recast in the late 1990s and early 2000s to bring in a new Catholic project, which doesn't necessarily align with, some of these more satirical authors, or these authors who, again, are I think, presenting a complexity of emotions that is still worth taking seriously as historians, even if we may not always take it literally. So thank you so much again. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that. What can we learn from these different pieces of literature, these different texts, musical texts and written texts about the ways in which Cristeros continue, and descendants of Cristeros continue to evaluate their participation in the rebellion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was going to say, Ethan, you're welcome to answer first. Or, so I'm so glad that you pointed out that last corrido, because it's very unique in the sense that it's not about a particular person. It's very much about this unnamed young person. It could have been anyone, and not so different from, some of these lesser known martyrs that Ethan was speaking about that are included in the periodicals. Just somebody from the countryside who heard that there were unjust laws and decided to go off and fight against, the government, and fight against the army and protect his faith, and ended up losing everything. And there's a moment in the corrido where he seeks solace from a priest, and the priest is telling him, oh, well, the battle is already won, the battle is over. And instead of celebrating, the person singing the corrido, it says that the young Cristero was just very sad and said, was this all worth it? And most of corridos from the time period are very celebratory. They're about epic heroes. They're about the people who won the battle, and how even if they died, they won, not giving up and, shouting Viva Cristo Rey, and then were executed, and that, we're celebrating their sacrifice. And here we have a very young person who we don't actually know in the corrido whether or not or how he died. We just know that on his grave, he mentions, I don't know who won. And it's almost as if he was this lost life, that could have lived on had it not been for this fight. And was it his fight to take on? Was it his responsibility? And it really transforms, at least from my experience, some of the memory that I have from my family. My parents have always been very proud that we have, Cristeros in the family, that we have this transnational folklore in my family of, our family in Mexico that were participating in this war, and that they met, General Gorostieta, and there's all of these things about how they would hide things under their dresses, to help the soldiers. But it's all very celebratory. And when I ask, well, like, how did they die? Didn't they die this like horrible way? And my family's like, yes, but they're heroes, they're celebrated. And this corrido, at least from my perspective of somebody who has, inherited memory of La Cristiada, it really makes me think, again about why are we glorifying these people who died, these young people, like they were and children who like went off and fought in this war, and as exemplars of the faith, just as sacrificial lambs almost to this fight that many of them never really understood what they were fighting for. They just were told that their religion was under attack.
Yeah.
So that, those are my thoughts on that. And I think that's what makes this such a provocative corrido, because it's so different than anything, and in its composition and in its lyrical text. So
I'm going to jump here because it links your piece to Ethan's. And I think it's very, very interesting how these people who were not the heroes, the martyrs, the celebrated ones, they actually survived. Well, some of them survived into the 30s and became these very angry guys who were disappointed at both a government who didn't acknowledge them and a church who didn't acknowledge them. And they became really very much, angry at both church and government. And they kept trying to remember the Cristero fight in their own terms. And I think that's something Ethan's paper can help us with. I remember at the Palomar y Vizcarra archive here in Mexico City, Palomar kept all kind of stuff about that particular mood. And it's very, very interesting because he was the president, the league's president. So he actually knew how the people were feeling in the 30s, not late in the 20s, but after the Cristero fight had ended. So, and that's pretty much what you are talking about. People who died and whose death wouldn't even make sense to anybody because they were not celebrated, they were not considered as martyrs, they were not a part of a church tradition, they were nothing. So and that is something that is very seldom taken into account when it comes to scholarship. So and both of your papers are going into that. So I think that's really important. The other Cristeros, those who didn't matter, so to speak.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Ethan.
No, I was going to say, I'm just going to answer briefly because there's already another question in the chat for you in particular, Teresita. So I'm going to, I think there's not really any space in David, going back to Christina's question, there's not really any space in David for mixed feelings. It's heroic. I think the only thing that actually does kind of capture that essence of mixed feelings or of ambivalence are the lacunas, or these big gaps. And I think the gaps in David are actually quite similar to the gaps that you point out, Teresita, in these songs, which is who actually gets a death scene. Because the heroes and the martyrs invariably get a very dramatic death scene, oftentimes that parallel the death of Christ. In his final days, they get very dramatic last words. But the Los Muertos and these women never get a death scene, even if they're executed for being a part of the rebellion. So if they never die on the page, then you don't have to remember their death, I guess. But that I think that's a really good question about this ambivalence.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Is there any other comment, or we can go into the chat? There are some questions here. Teresita, Andres is asking why would the Secretaría de Cultura would support the activities of mariachi?
Okay, yeah, I was noticing, so pregunta, ¿los corridos son propios de la región? Yes, they are. So they are from the region, like Miguel Gómez Loza was from the region. These were composed by Mariachi Moya and Mariachi Los Cristeros. So all three corridos that I talk about, which is el corrido de Miguel Gómez Loza, de Pio Quinto Moya, y el corrido de un cristero, are all composed by the group. They do perform other corridos that are more historical, like Valentín de la Sierra and Martín Díaz and Quirino Navarro, and like all of those from the time period, they do perform that. The reason that I think that there is a collaboration with La Secretaría de Cultura from Jalisco is because as a mariachi group, you know, mariachi, the tradition, started in Jalisco. And so this is part of the cultural patrimony of the region. And so it gives them, remember that they are first and foremost this larger mariachi called Mariachi Moya, and Mariachi Los Cristeros is like a subgroup of Mariachi Moya, and they started entering these competitions because they wanted to be different, they wanted to stand out, and because they're from Cristero, you know, the heartland of Cristero territory, they have this, you know, their own cultural memory and patrimony that they decided to implement in their group, and they are interesting, and so people go to their concerts. They are more fascinated by the way that they dress. Instead of having a charro outfit, they are dressed as, you know, campesinos and revolutionaries and a priest and a monaguillo. And I think that their collaboration with La Secretaría de Cultura is to educate the public about the music and the history from there. And they're, you know, a very prominent group in the highlands of Jalisco. So that is my thought, is that the Secretaría will support them because they are actually doing a public service. They are, you know, promoting the arts that were born in that region, along with the history that is important to that region. And then there is another question from Maria Isabel that says, metodológicamente, ¿qué dificultades encontró para trabajar dichas fuentes? Okay, so it was very difficult because some of the work I've been doing is from the pandemic and pre-pandemic, when I was not able to travel, and most of my collections are archived in YouTube. And so these are digital archives from the present. This is not like going to a library and having somebody lay out these for you. I have to search for them in YouTube to find them, and communicating with the group was very difficult because in the final year of my dissertation, this was when I wanted to do last minute research and I couldn't go at all because everything was closed, and I was at a loss. I was only communicating through email and through Messenger and through WhatsApp and any way that I could to get information. And that was one of the most difficult things that I encountered, was communicating with the group, and also trying to decide, is my work ethnographic or is it an analytical of the music itself, or is it both? So right now it is heavy on the analysis because I haven't been able to sit down with the group and interview them. They're always on tour, so it's very hard. And I haven't seen any new recordings. I hope they haven't stopped recording or haven't stopped, you know, their group, Los Cristeros. Pero eso fue lo que tuve muchísima dificultad en comunicarme con ellos, porque todo tenía que ser digitalmente, todo tenía que ser por email, por WhatsApp, por Facebook, y algunas veces no me contestaban porque estaban muy ocupados. Entonces yo, pues, lo que hice fue, fui en YouTube hice traducí todo el texto de los corridos y luego empecé a analizar también lo que habían ellos archivado en YouTube de pues cuando tocaban ahí regionalmente en Acatic o en festivales de mariachi, festivales regionales, religiosos. Entonces era como un archivo YouTube para mí.
Muchas gracias, Teresita. Solo para precisar esto que está explicando Teresita a propósito de cómo la Secretaría de Cultura tiene convenios con Mariachi y los Cristeros, es estándar en México. En realidad las secretarías de cultura no pueden apoyar grupos religiosos bajo ninguna circunstancia, sería anticonstitucional si lo hicieran, pero dado que este no es un grupo religioso, sino un grupo musical derivado además de otro mariachi, no hay ningún problema. Y eso hacen las secretarías de cultura. Con mucha frecuencia apoyan a cualquier forma de artistas para que hagan presentaciones públicas que son a su vez gratuitas. Entonces, esto es muy común y no funciona así en los Estados Unidos, pero aquí no hay ningún problema con hacerlo. De hecho, en alguna parte en el texto, Pillo dice, bueno, como nos está pagando la Secretaría de Cultura, yo los tengo que educar de alguna manera, ¿no? O sea, tiene muy claro esto. El propio Pillo, el personaje que favorito de Teresita. Bueno, no sé si hay más dudas, preguntas, comentarios sobre estos textos tan lindos. Aplausos, sí, aplausos. Bueno, pues...
María Isabel, ¿tenías algo que decir o contestar?
Sí, respecto al el primer trabajo que se presentó, creo que me parece o es mi impresión, de alguna manera he tenido un poco de contacto en México con algunos grupos religiosos, ¿no? Estoy un poquito ya estudiando aquí las cuestiones de las prácticas religiosas contemporáneas y creo que justamente el tema sobre este vínculo con el David y toda esta cuestión de la figura del Padre Pro y la beatificación y la canonización, me parece que recientemente hay como vamos a decir, programa en México por parte de la Iglesia de recuperar estas figuras de la cristiada, ¿no? Especialmente con la reciente canonización de este niño mártir, San José Sánchez del Río, que es otra figura bien interesante para estudiar, ¿no? Porque además ha generado una serie de movimientos al interior de la Iglesia Católica en México que están recuperando, reitero, pues esta figura, ¿no? Y no solamente de él, sino de los mártires de la cristiandad en Tlaxcala, ¿no? Que son dos fenómenos de canonización muy recientes y que, bueno, de alguna manera, pues ahí hay como la parte discursiva, ¿no? De reivindicación de algunos espacios, recuperación de algunos espacios y pues diría Hospan, ¿no? La invención de la tradición en introducir nuevas devociones dentro del santoral mexicano.
Iden, Teresita, ¿quieren responder a lo que nos dice María Isabel?
Lo siento, tenía problemas de escucharte.
Claro.
¿Puedes escribir un poco sobre tu pregunta en el chat y yo puedo responder?
Hay una cosa que había olvidado mencionar. Ethan, en el principio de tu capítulo mencionas, solo es una mención, no es nada importante, pero mencionas a Miguel Pro, pero él no fue canonizado, él no ha sido canonizado todavía, de hecho todavía está ahí en el proceso. Él fue beatificado, pero en 1988, ¿no? De hecho, él fue el primero y no forma parte de este grupo de los canonizados en el 2000, que son una cosa completamente distinta. Incluso en términos de la propia iglesia son totalmente diferentes. Entonces, solo para que lo mires.
See, thank you for the correction. It was a small mistake.
Yeah, it's a small mistake. And just at the beginning, I think it's the first paragraph.
Right. You should say beatified, not canonized, right?
Well, anything else, guys?
I think Maria Isabel is typing her question.
Yeah.
Good.
Gracias para escribirlo.
By the way, Yves Solis, who's here, has been working extensively on the child. What's the name? Sánchez del Río?
José Sánchez del Río.
That one. So, well, in the meantime, great work, guys. I think both of you have done a very, very interesting thing, and well, it'll go a long way. So it's super interesting, really. Will you be publishing this one as a paper, right, Teresita?
Yes, so I plan to first not publish it, but present it as a paper and then get, enough feedback. My goal is to turn it into an article and submit it. I don't know where actually to submit it to, if I should submit it to a music journal, to a historical journal, to...
I would say Estudios Mexicanos. They are, interdisciplinary and they take everything. So it's a very good journal.
Okay. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. So Maria Isabel, I think she... No, not yet. María Isabel, would you like to ¿querrías repetir la pregunta para que Ethan pueda?
Ok, la había escrito en el chat. En cuanto a estas formas de recuperación de las figuras de la cristiandad que ha estado haciendo recientemente la iglesia, como la figura de Sánchez del Río y los mártires de la cristiandad, ¿cómo podemos vincularlas, digamos, ya no alcanzo a escribir completa, pero bueno, cómo podemos vincularlas a los estudios recientes sobre religiosidad popular?
¿Cómo separar los dos? Los proyectos de la iglesia y los proyectos populares.
¿Cómo podemos vincularlos? Vale.
Ok, las conexiones entre los proyectos de la iglesia y los proyectos populares. Ok, gracias. Tengo dos gatos que están gritando y no puedo escuchar. It's a difficult question because as Marisol has so illustrated very clearly, there's so much hostility, especially in the 1930s and 40s between these two factions. I'm sort of undecided because this is still a chapter in progress. I'm still undecided how much I want to engage with the second half of the 20th century and post-Cold War memory of the Cristiada. I think there's certainly been more merging, more connection between the two versions or the two understandings of the Cristiada. What I'm interested in, and this context might clarify it, is the transnational memory construction, the connections between what's going on here and memory in Mexico and corresponding in Spain, where many of these priests and many of these fighters go to and connect with. In fact, after 1929, Marcel, as you mentioned, the Archbishop of Mexico tries to sort of regain control of the church in Mexico. He does this in close collaboration with the Archbishop of Toledo. And with the Catholic press there in Spain. And so there are these many connections. I actually see more popular and official church connections between the lay people in Spain and the Mexican church than the Mexican church and Mexican believers until a much later period. So that's how I imagine it. I'm sorry, I hope, espero que respondo a tu pregunta from limited information.
Yes, please.
That's a key point you're making. The Spanish connection is really, really important, especially about martyrs.
Yes.
And when they are talking about martyrs in Mexico, they are actually re-elaborating the deaths of Spanish martyrs. So that's very, very important.
There's this wonderful quote I have. Mexicans are sent to Spain to study in seminary during the Cristiada. As they're leaving, they get a send-off party, and a Spaniard in 1929 in the fall writes a letter to the Archbishop of Mexico where he says, "I hope one day I can die for my country and my faith." So it's
yeah, that's really, and in that sense, the period, the David period you are studying is very, very important because he's speaking to them, not only to Mexico but also to Spain, and that's really interesting. Well, I think we can finish up now. Thank you so much, guys, for being here. Thank you, Teresita. Thank you, Ethan. Hope seeing you guys soon. And well, until next time.
Thank you so much, Marisol, for your comments, and everyone for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bye.